Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Barbara Swanson from NYSAIS. Welcome to the webinar today. You might see on my screen that it says that I'm Mark Loria, but as you can see, I am not. Mark is not able to be with us today. I want to introduce Sarah Daignault, who will be our webinar leader today, and Sarah can introduce the topic. Don't forget that at the bottom of your control panel there is a chat window, so if you have questions or comments during this webinar, feel free to type those in there. I'll try to keep my eye on those and call some of those questions to Sarah's attention as we go along. So Sarah, welcome.
Thank you, Barbara. I want to now hold on a second. Having small technical difficulties here with the screen. There we go. So thank you for having me here at the NYSAIS webinar. My background, just for those of you who may not have heard me speak in the past, I, for 10 years, was a business manager at 2 different independent schools in Baltimore. And while I was doing that, I served on the board of Madeira School, which is my alma mater. I served on their board for 19 years, and in addition to chairing the board, I chaired the capital campaign and chaired the head search, so I've done a number of different sort of serious board tasks. We've done a sort of a series of these webinars, so we did one in the fall and one in January, and this is the final one. What I want to do today is talk about voluntary giving and sort of how we think about this. I'm hoping that some of what I have to say is provocative and causes you to sort of have questions about your giving programs at your school and the point of those. So what I wanted to do first, hold on, there we go, is here's sort of what I want to do. Is we're going to begin by exploring fundraising in general so that we're all on the same page. When I talk about fundraising, you know what I mean, and whatever. And then we're going to switch gears into a book written by Richard Soghoian, who is the head of school at Columbia Grammar and Prep in New York City. And he's raised some sort of pretty provocative questions about giving in general and annual giving in specific. And then I want to connect his questions with the whole issue of financial sustainability, because one of the things about reading Richard's book for me was that it caused me to think about financial sustainability and to begin to try and answer some of the questions that have been troubling me. And my hope is that when we're finished with this webinar, you will all be able to go back to your schools and have some pretty deep conversations about fundraising and your school. So Andrew, if you can do the polling question.
Here it goes. So we'll leave it up for about 30 seconds or so until everybody gets an answer in there.
Yeah, this is the point where all of you have to figure out how to answer the question, because it's really helpful to me to know who is on this call. You know, the good news about the webinar is that you don't have to leave home to listen to some professional development. The bad news is I have no idea who's out there, and so this is my way of trying to get a sense of the audience.
So we're 75% of the way there, so we have a few more to go. So we'll leave it for another 5 to 10 seconds and then we'll close it.
Great. Thank you, Andrew.
Yep.
And if you're wondering, Andrew is the tech guru for NYSAIS. He makes sure that we all have the technology we need and that it works. And
thanks,
so
Sarah.
he's sort of behind in the background, taking care of us.
All right, I'm going to close it and then share our results. We had most everybody vote. So as you can see, 20% heads, 40% trustees, 10% for development officers and business officers, and 20% are the mysterious other.
Great. Cool. Well, thanks. I appreciate all of you letting me know. So I want to begin with this slide, and we'll spend some time talking about it, because I think in one slide one can capture here the whole of fundraising in independent schools the way we do it. fundraising it's all about constituent relations, and that's where we begin. If you think about it as a house, and that's what you're looking at, the house of development, think about how people come to your schools. They come as prospective parents and then ultimately parents, and we try at the point when a student is admitted, we try to help that student and their family feel like they are part of our school community. So they immediately start receiving communications from us, publications. In this era of social media, they may be able to like us on Facebook or Twitter or Pinterest or whatever your social media is. And we give them lots of opportunities to volunteer. Do they want to be a classroom helper in the lower school and come and read with the students? Do they want to come and bring cupcakes on holidays? Do they want to drive on trips? Whatever. And the whole point of that is keeping them connected to the school. The reason we want to connect people to the school is that in order to ask people for money, they need to believe in our cause. And if they feel the parents feel part of the school in some way, shape, or form, they're more likely to have a positive response to our appeal. And we use annual giving as sort of the main entry point into the House of Development. So think about the fall, you've got back-to-school meetings, and one of the people who gets an opportunity to speak at the back-to-school meeting is the annual giving chair or co-chair. Sometimes there's two people, sometimes there's a whole group of people, and they are helping the audience understand that annual giving is an integral part of our budget process, and it's a way that each of us as parents or alumni of a school can help the school meet its financial obligations. Annual giving is used for operations, and it's an annual thing. And what the first-time giver doesn't quite understand is that once you give once, it is an opportunity to give again the following year and to give more than you did the year before. And so we have a whole process about this. And it helps us as members of a community feel like we're actually doing something to support the school. The beautiful thing about schools, there are nonprofit schools, 501c3 schools, is that our gifts are tax deductible to the extent allowed by law. So if you give a small annual fund gift and you don't itemize your deductions, you don't get to deduct. But if you do itemize your deductions, that you take all your philanthropic giving and you get to subtract that off your taxes to some degree. There are some, of course, the IRS doesn't want you to get away with this forever, so there are some upper limits, but we're not going to worry about that right now. But what happens is when you become a giver to annual fund, then we begin to deepen our relationship. And because what we want is we want you to come upstairs in the house. We want you to come up to where we have more significant giving. Now you'll notice on my slide that this house has two doors. There's some people who just do not get excited about annual giving. And their giving style, their philanthropic style, is much more public. And they are much more excited about fundraising events we might have. Many schools have auctions or other events that allow people to more publicly display their philanthropy. And so they're maybe not going to come in through the front door through annual giving, but they will come in through the side door. Because the wonderful thing about auctions is it is another way to provide resources to help our schools. You can be a volunteer on the auction committee and you can help organize the gifts. And then on the night of the auction, whether it's a silent auction, a live auction, a combination, an online auction, all of these things are ways for you, the donor, to give the school money and to get something back in return. Maybe you get a special bottle of wine, a trip, a piece of jewelry, and a piece of art made by the second grade class, any of those things. It's another way to get you into the house. Because what we want to have happen is we want you to deepen your relationship with our school. So if the school is a K-12 school, we've got 11, 12 years, if your child comes in kindergarten, to really develop a relationship with your family and to provide you with other philanthropic opportunities. In the course of your child's time at the school, we may have multiple capital campaigns for buildings, for endowment. You might have a family foundation, and we'd like to develop a relationship with your foundation to see if they too would support the school. Maybe you have a particular interest and you want to do some restricted giving because you want to you want to fund a particular thing that is something that's dear to your child's heart or whatever. And that's really what happens on the second floor of our house. On the third floor of our house, we work in the area of major gifts and planned giving for families who have deep resources. Sorry, I don't know how to make. Nope. There we go. Sorry. So for families who have deep resources and really want to find another level to support the school, a major gifts option or a planned gift are something that will fit within their other financial considerations. And the ultimate gift at the top of our house is not the school's ultimate gift, it's the donor's ultimate gift. Thinking about their long-term plans, their estate planning, having the school figure prominently in that is not something that everyone does, but for the families who are looking for ways to manage their resources, this is sort of the ultimate contribution and can quite often be transformative in a school's fundraising program. Off to the right on the yellow box, you'll see where it says R&D, corporate support, special projects. For many schools, there are opportunities to have these other sources of income, but they are few and far between and they are unusual. They're not the sort of standard kind of thing that we do. But when I talk about our fundraising program at school, this is what I'm picturing. It's this house. And all the myriad of ways that people, both parents, students, and alumni can participate in the school's financial well-being. I wanted you to see that because now I want to shift gears a little bit. So here's the book. This is the cover of the book, and it's called Mind the Gap. Richard is the long-serving head of Columbia Grammar and Prep. When it says on the cover, an insider's irreverent look at private schools' finances and management, it is irreverent. And I need to prepare you for that. What I love about Richard's book and other resources for schools where they take strong positions on different things is that it gives us an opportunity to question our thinking and to have deep conversations, which for trustees are really important. Quite often you sit there and say, we should talk about important things. Well, Richard's going to ask us to think some stuff. So in the book, there are 12 principles, and I have them on 2 slides here. And here's the color coding. When it's in black, I agree with him. When it's in red, I think we should talk about it. So you can see that by about the 3rd page, when I was reading this book, I was sort of jumping up and down. How can you say that? But by about page 25, I was making mad notes because Richard was causing me to think in ways I hadn't been asked to think before. Which, when you think that I have been talking about school finance for 30 years, this is pretty interesting that, you know, I found this so challenging. So the first principle is really important for all of us, is don't assume that things are being done right just because we've always done it that way. We laugh about it in independent schools when someone says, well, we've always done it that way. As soon as you hear that, bells should ring. You should then immediately question, well, why have we always done it this way, and is it the right way? So Richard and I are in total agreement. And so then we start digging into what he's trying to get us to think about. So principle number 2, the administration of any private school primarily expands according to the amount of voluntary giving available. Really? Do you have more administrators just because you have a bigger annual fund than the school down the street? I'm not sure that that's right. But we need to think about the size of your administration. One of the things that's really important when you look at statistics about costs in schools, because as tuitions have been rising, a number of us have gone back and we've pulled up the NYSAIS statistics to try and figure out what is driving tuition numbers higher and higher. And the biggest piece that drives tuition numbers higher is the amount of money we spend on compensation. When you dig down and figure out what's actually going on, teacher salaries have gone up, but they haven't gone up dramatically over the last 15 years. They've gone up a little bit more than inflation, but not a lot. But what has changed is the staffing levels in our schools. And one particular area is administration. And so I would ask all of us, when you think about your school, is to go back and look at who works in your administration. Back in the day, the Frank Boyden day, when many of us weren't even born. There was one head of school, and the head of school had a very efficient assistant. And, maybe there was a business manager and someone maybe doing admissions, maybe not. And that was about it. And they didn't need an upper school head. They didn't need a middle school head. They didn't need a dean of faculty. The head of school did all of that. But the complexity in our schools has changed dramatically. And one of the things that independent schools do is when you have a problem, we try and figure out how to hire someone to solve that problem. So I ask you, in light of Richard's principle number 2, to go back and think about the administrators in your school and how many of them do we really need. I'm sure that they're all wonderful people. I'm not talking about individuals, but conceptually, what size administration do we need for the number of students in our schools? So moving on to principle number 3. So Richard says annual fund goals are never determined by the amount of need, but always by the amount of wealth in the community being solicited. And at this point I'm going, Richard, give me a break. As a business manager, that is not how I approached budgeting. We sat there and said to ourselves, how much can we charge in tuition? And how else can we fund the needs of this school? And we began with need, programmatic need. What did we need to deliver the program that best typified our mission? And so for the first school where I worked, we had an enormous commitment to economic diversity. And so our biggest need was financial aid. We did not have an endowment to speak of. So all of our financial aid was funded through annual fund. So the more annual funds, the more we could fund financial aid. And that was what drove us as we thought about annual fund. The wealth of our community was not part of our thinking. But this principle makes me say, okay, so why do we have annual fund? And some schools are really able to articulate that. And others are, well, we've always done this, and so does everybody else. And it's a way for parents to give us more money and to get a tax break. And all of those are fine. But I would ask you to think more deeply about it. So then we're going to move along to principle number 4. So now we've got Richard telling us that voluntary contributions to the operating budget of a private school always lead to overspending. Seriously. Okay, now he and I are having real problems. Fortunately, I went and I visited Richard at his school, and he couldn't be nicer. We had a great time. And there's a whole lot that he and I share in common. So when I talk about fighting with him, it's conceptually. I was sitting in my own house reading the book, jumping up and down every now and then when he said something. It gave me pause. But he's, in principle number 4, implying that there is this vicious cycle. So we have voluntary contributions, we overspend, which leads us to needing more voluntary contributions, which leads us to driving up the cost of tuition, and so that they aren't helping us maintain tuition levels. And I'm going, all right, I'm willing to go back and really think about annual fund again. So now we come to principle number 5. Where he says tuition income should always be about the present, and voluntary giving should be for the future. And I'm willing to give him some of this. Absolutely, tuition income should be for the present. When you think about the amount that we're charging for tuition today, any parent who's being asked to pay that amount should feel like what they're paying gets their student an excellent education today. And if we want them, parents, alums, to contribute to the future of the school, we should be clear about that. And it should be part of a fundraising campaign. So I'm totally okay about this. Principle number 6. Richard is telling us that if you have endowments, if you're a college and university, or annual funds if you're a private school, that the ever-increasing annual fund is giving us a false sense of security and well-being. And the more sort of the bigger the annual fund, the more dependent we are on giving. This is a really important point, and I want to hold that thought because we're going to come back to that in a couple of slides. So here are the rest of them. You'll see some more red, but some more black. I love this. Richard's rule of thumb is that where endowment is greater than the operating budget, and if your school has such an endowment, you're fortunate. He says that the amount of waste in that school is equivalent to your annual fund. I don't know where he gets this stuff. But it is fascinating to me to think about the question of waste in light of his earlier question about the administration and, where has our money gone in the last 15 years as we look at the growth in staff. Now I have to tell you, a lot of the new positions in our school add a great deal to the curriculum that we're providing for students. So I'm not sitting here arbitrarily saying just because you've added a bunch of new positions you need to do away with those. We need to look at them and figure out which ones are really helpful and which ones are not. So one of the things that we have a lot more of in schools today than we had 15 years ago are learning specialists. Why is that? We know a lot more about how kids learn, and we realize that all kids don't learn the same way. And the learning specialists do 2 things. They help students who need support to master the curriculum that they're confronted with, and they also help teachers with learning how to meet different learning styles. And both of those things are really helpful in helping our schools be effective schools. So while Richard's sitting there saying there's waste, I'm still willing to say, let's think about this. I don't want to, just arbitrarily say, let's do away with a bunch of extra positions. Let's go back and figure out whether we really need these. Richard would say to me, he said, listen, I have a business manager, and so I have the same guy I've had for a long time, and I just ask him to do more to pay him more, which is principle number 9. Hire the fewest number of administrators and pay them as much as possible. That's all fine and well, but there comes a point when there are just not enough hours in the day to get the work done. And that's the point where principle 9 and principle 7, sort of come at odds with each other. So his title, Mind the Gap. For your school, if your school uses the gap as part of your annual fund appeal, funding, the gap between the amount that we charge for tuition and the amount it costs to educate students. That gap, depending on your school, could be anywhere between $1,000 and $6,000 per student. Richard says we're focused on the wrong thing. We should be looking at the amount we spend on administrative expense versus the amount on academic expense, instead of worrying about the amount of tuition income versus operating expense. And I think he's got a point when he says, let's really look at how we're spending the money. So principle number 10, he says, annual giving is in reality equivalent to long-term debt. I've been scratching my head about this. I'm not clear what he's talking about. I think he feels like the more annual giving you have, the more you're indebted, because he says that on the previous page. But I'm not sure about all of that. I do love principle number 11, where it says, waste in any bureaucracy always grows exponentially, not arithmetically. I love the concept of waste. One of the things we looked at in 2009, in the spring of 2009, as we were recovering from, mentally recovering from the economic mess of the fall of 2008, we began to look around our schools in a way we had never looked around them before. You know, were there ways we could cut expenses? Because we knew that our families had been hit by the economic conditions and that we needed to respond to them with as small a tuition increase as possible. Recognizing that our staff, our teachers, are not incredibly well paid, and so, you know, trying to figure out how to balance this need to keep our expenses down, compensation being the largest expense in our schools, we began to look for waste. One of the things that has made the United States really slow to recover from the mess of 2008 is that many companies took this opportunity to figure out where their waste was. They laid off a lot of people, some of them parents in our schools. And now that things are getting better, you know, we heard the latest economic news that we've gotten back all the jobs that were lost. But what's interesting is they aren't the same jobs. It may be the same number of jobs, but they're different jobs. You know, they're in the restaurant industry as opposed to in businesses where people who were laid off with skills. And those businesses have found ways to get their work done with fewer people. Schools are a people-centric organization. And we have a real hard time getting rid of people, and you know, and that's something that as trustees we struggle with. So his last principle is always run your school as a business. Couldn't agree with him more. I come from the business side of things. That doesn't mean you don't have a mission. It doesn't mean you don't have a heart. It doesn't mean it's not a community. It's just think about the business of your school. For every one of our schools, we are multi-million-dollar businesses. It's big business running a school, and so we need to be mindful of that. So you're sitting there saying, where is all of this going? So here are my questions that I want to think about. After I put his book down and I started, you know, then I assembled all my thoughts and began sort of more calmly proceeding with all of this. I began asking myself, okay, so annual giving. How do you set the annual giving goal at your school? Is it based on need? What kind of need? What is it that your school needs? Is it based on, you know, the amount you raised last year? Well, last year we raised $500,000, so this year we can raise $500,000. Or do you say, last year we raised $500,000, this year we can raise $550,000? And why do you have annual giving? Those are really important things to ask in the context of your school. So I've known a few schools who charge what it costs. If you read the literature from ISM, Independent School Management out of Delaware, Independent School Management says we should all be charging what it costs. Stop apologizing for your tuition. charge what it costs, and we have such a unique product that people will still come and they'll still pay for it. And that's fine if you're in a community with high demand for your school. If you're struggling to fill your school and you hear that, part of you is going, well, you know, that's lovely for ISM to say, but can we really do that? The schools that I know who charge what it costs came to some very serious financial problem. They came to the edge of the cliff, if you will. And they had two choices. One was to go over the cliff and go out of business. And the second was to retool everything and save the school. And in each case, the parent body came together and said, we'll do what it takes to save the school. And so one of the things they did is that they paid what it cost. And they were able to maintain that. So then suddenly, annual giving, the idea that people want to give you something because they really love your mission and what's happening, they were able to use that for the extras we talk about. So I would ask your board, your development committee, to go back and have a serious thought conversation about annual giving. I talked earlier about the, yeah.
There's a question in the question box from Susan Marcinek, who asks, is there a rule of thumb for the ratio of administration expense to annual budget for New York City or New York State? And maybe you're covering that in your next section here. I'm just not sure.
I'm not. That's a great question, Barbara, and I don't know the answer to that. One of the wonderful things about independent schools is we are incredibly independent, and we all do things differently. What would be great, Barbara, is to pull the NYSAIS statistics and take a look at sort of high, low, and median ratios of administrative expense, and we could look at it, you know, from a compensation standpoint. So administrative compensation versus total compensation or academic compensation. It's not something I should have thought about that, but a great question. You know, we haven't looked at that. You know, I think about, and I say that there are a number of groups of schools that have come together to look at statistics, and my guess is that some of them have looked at this. So there's ABOPS, which is the Association of Business Officers of Private Schools, and it is primarily the schools that are New England boarding schools. There are a few schools that are not in New England that are in the ABOPS group. They've looked at their data. There is an outfit called Index that has a couple of cohorts of schools where they really look at data. And so what we should do, Barbara, is we should, after this, is go pull some data and see if we can take a look at what the range is so that each school could look at the NYSAIS range and then ask themselves, where do we fit on this spectrum? Are we on the high side, the low side? Where do we want to be and why? Because that's really the question. It's when you begin with your mission, and when you know what your mission is, then you can say, all right, how does our administrative expense support our mission? Because when you start looking at the numbers, you can't get so excited about the numbers and forget the mission. Because that's why families come to our schools. We are providing their children with education that is superior enough that they want to come and spend our, their hard-earned money on our tuitions. So great question. So Richard keeps talking about waste. He's talking about wasting money because we're spending it on things we don't need. As we all look at our tuition levels, is there waste in our schools? And that's something where you have to sort of take apart your school. Are there things that we don't have to provide, that parents don't need? And when I start thinking about independent schools, it is in large part, we are a luxury brand. People come to us for a variety of reasons that are not dissimilar to why you would spend a lot of money on a car. And, you know, part of it is status. They want to be part of a community. But part of it is there is a quality of our product that they believe is better than any of the other options available to them. And so when I talk about waste, you know, I'm sitting here thinking about my car, and it has, you know, at least 1 or 2 extra cup holders I don't really need. But then I don't ride in the back seat of my car. I drive my car. But someone sitting in the back seat might disagree and say, wait a minute, I need that cup holder. The person, the being who sits in my back seat is a dog, and the dog really doesn't need the cup holder. So, you know, could my car be a little less expensive with 1 less cup holder? I don't know. But, you know, I think about all the bells and whistles. Today, the #1 thing I look at when I am buying a car is, does my car have Bluetooth connectivity with my phone? Because I want to be safe on the road. You know, 10 years ago, that wasn't even an option. So when I ask you to think about waste in your school, you know, that's another, it's another thing we need to quantify. And, you know, this whole question about gap, another question for you guys. All right, so I'm going to move on because what I want to talk about now is another reading. So Regina Hertzlinger has been part of the faculty of the Harvard Graduate School of Education for a long time. And back in 1997, she wrote this you know, paper on, she was looking at the question of nonprofit organizations, not specifically schools, but all nonprofits, trying to figure out if there was a way to measure success other than looking at the bottom line. Because if you're a nonprofit, you're all about mission. And she came up with 4 questions that she felt, if you could answer them, would help you determine how you were doing as an organization. Here are her 4 questions, and we're going to delve into these a little bit because they're really important, and you'll see how this all ties to Richard's book, because it all does go together. Yeah.
Before we get to those 4 questions, there are a couple more from the audience.
Oh, great.
If we could maybe handle those first.
Yeah.
The first one is from Daniel Doherty, who asks, if you conduct that study of administrative cost ratio, it would seem important to define clearly what jobs each school is counting in the bucket so that we have an apples-to-apples comparison, which is very astute.
Well, clearly Daniel's done some work with statistics. The hardest part about looking at data is getting the definitions right, so that when you're looking at one school to another, that everybody's using the same measuring stick. And really great point. And you know, and that's something we'll have to look very carefully at.
Right. And then the next question from Thomas Walker is, don't almost all independent schools have expenses greater than revenues? As a result, don't all independent schools need annual giving to fund that gap? And isn't the gap increasing even if tuition and salaries increase at the same rate? The fact is revenues are similar, the fact is revenues are smaller than expenses. And and where does all of this lead us?
Right. And that's really the question that we all are faced with. And I want to come back to that as we go through Reggie's final question about present resources being sustainable. So, so I'll hold that thought, but it's a great question. Anything else?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. All right, so let's go through Reggie's questions. The second one and the fourth one are the 2 that will take us back to the annual giving question. So the first one, where she says, are our goals consistent with our financial resources? There are 2 ways of looking at this. One of them is pretty obvious, is if your school has limited financial resources and you have enormous goals, you have to sit there and say, well, okay, we have these great big dreams. We have no idea how to fund them. And that makes a lot of sense. So one of the things we think about is, we talk about small classes. Small classes are a real cost to our school because if your school routinely has classes of 11 or 12 students, then one faculty member is dealing with 12 students. What if that were 16 students? Then you'd have more kids in the class. The teacher would be more cost effective. I use that term very carefully. But if we have small classes and then we say in the next breath that as trustees we set a policy that we want to pay the highest salaries or be in the top 5% of schools in our comparison group or whatever we say. So in one breath we say small classes and the next breath we say high salaries. We're creating two competing goals for ourselves. And so what if we eased up a little on the small class size? Because one of the things that's really interesting is that there is no literature that says that a class of 12 is better, more effective than a class of 16. Now, there is some indication that when you're dealing with really small young children, so kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, that class size has a much bigger impact than later on. And there's some subject matter, particularly foreign language, where smaller classes are sometimes useful. But as a rule, to say, our goal is to have our median class size be 12, you're sitting there saying, we're really going to cut our revenue because if you could put more kids in the class, then that teacher becomes more cost effective. So this is a place where the consistency between our goals and our financial resources comes, into question. And so one of the things I put enrollment stability up here. If one of the things that we're looking at is new facilities and growth, that's a goal for us. But our financial resources tied to enrollment, and can we predict enrollment? Certainly New York City is a different sort of situation than much of the rest of New York State, where there still are more kids who want to come to independent schools in New York City than there are places for them. But is the same true in Buffalo and Rochester and Ithaca and Albany? And and that's a question that you have to figure out. When you think about new facilities and your desire for new facilities, what is your capacity on the fundraising side or on the debt side to fund those new facilities? So Reggie's asking you to think about all of these things. The flip side of this question is, what if you have a large endowment and you're not using it to its fullest capacity to underwrite your school? One of the questions that I've always had is, if you look at, I'm continually jealous of schools that have endowments of $500 million. Who wouldn't be? $500 million in the bank, that would be great. But let's say you only have $100 million. But still, that's an enormous endowment. But what you notice is schools with really large endowments, their tuitions are pretty consistent. They may be a couple of $1,000s different than the rest of schools with much smaller endowments, but they're pretty close. Why aren't they using their endowments to significantly lower tuition? And it's an interesting question. We get back to some of this luxury brand thing. In the United States, there is sort of an underlying belief, and one can question whether it's valid or not, but there is this perception that if something costs more, it's worth more. And if you have an independent school with a tuition that's half of everybody else, there's a statement in that it's half as good. I question whether that's even remotely true, but it's another thing for you to think about as trustees. So,
Sarah,
yeah.
I have a question about endowment and annual fund.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned endowments. Schools with huge endowments often don't charge less in tuition, but do they continue to have annual funds at the same rate and
Oh, yeah.
raise as much money annually as schools without a big endowment?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's a significant part because it's the entry into the house. And, you know, they want to help us all deepen our relationship with the institution so that when they come back with the capital campaign for more endowment or a new field house, you know, we've already got a relationship with them. And so we can think about making a more significant gift. Great question. You know, think about Harvard, Princeton, Stanford. They do an amazing job with fundraising despite enormous endowment capacity. This is one of those things, if you follow the career of Charles Grassley, you know, who was in the United States government, you know, he is continually on the back of nonprofits because he doesn't think we spend enough of our endowments. If we were private foundations, we would be required to spend 5% of our endowments. But because we are 501c3s, we do not have that requirement. And so many schools believe that spending 4% is a better you know, use of the endowment to preserve capital over time. And Mr. Grassley's very unhappy about that because he believes that, you know, we got our tax exemption because we do this public good for the country, and we should be spending this money rather than letting it pile up. Anyway, that's a whole other topic. That's beyond today's capacity. So the next thing that Reggie wants us to think about are sources and uses of resources matched. So think about this. Your tuition income comes because families sign an enrollment agreement saying that they're going to send their child to our school and they agree to pay our tuition for this year, whatever it is. It is a legally binding contract. And so you think about revenue on one side with a legally binding contract. On the other side, on the expense side, the school has an employment agreement with all of its employees. And even if you're an at-will state, with our teachers, they have you know, a contract for all intents and purposes that says we, the school, hire you to teach for the school year, and it too is legally enforceable. So when you think about tuition revenue on one side and salary expense on the other side, both of those are the same kind of sources and uses. So when Reggie talks about sources and uses being matched, that's what she's talking about. And so you can see here, I've got endowment income on one side. Endowment income is something you can count on. 2008, we all held our breath. But most schools' endowments came through the mess of 2008. There were some blips, but you could sort of count on it. And for many schools, they have auxiliary programs, summer camp, building rentals, and whatever. All of that provides sources of revenue. So the question earlier about revenue, when you put all of this together, you may have enough to pay for the things that you'd absolutely expect. So when I put utilities up here, I'm a parent. I expect, you know, particularly today it's a cloudy day in New York City, so I expect to be able to turn on the lights. And if it's cold, I expect that there's heat in the building. And these days I expect the technology to work. There's a whole lot of things that I expect. And so when Reggie's talking about sources and uses being matched, we want guaranteed income paying the guaranteed expense. And so then you get here, and this goes back to the question that the guy asked. Our fixed expenses, which is the cost of our people, the cost of our buildings, you know, all of those things, we're paying them with variable revenue when we start using annual fund. Because here's the deal. Nobody has to give us annual giving. The world could wake up tomorrow and say, you know, I'm done with annual giving. I don't want to do that anymore. And that would be a real problem for all of us. What would we do? And have we thought about what happens? And, you know, you think about the last 15 years in schools. So there's the tech bust, and the market goes crazy, and the world feels like, oh my goodness, what's coming to an end, and voluntary giving slows down a little bit, and then it comes back. There's 9/11, voluntary giving comes back. There's 2008, voluntary giving comes back. One of the beautiful things about the independent school sector is that we are very protected against the variations. People keep giving to us, but they don't have to. So hold that thought. Move on to the next question, which is generational equity. Basically in schools we have two very significant, we could have two very significant assets. If your school has an endowment, it's asset number one as I'm thinking about them right now. Endowments in the millions are something that we need to take care of. And so what do? We have a series of policies about how we're going to invest it, how much we're going to spend, and all of that is designed to protect the corpus so that the purchasing power of our endowment is the same for the next generation of students, or greater for the next generations of students than it is now. Our next biggest asset, and for many schools this is your only large asset, are your buildings and your land. This is another thing that we as trustees need to take care of. We take a look at deferred maintenance. We put aside money for taking care of the facility. That set of initials, PRISM, PPRRSM, which is the provision for plant replacement, renewal, and special maintenance. But our PRISM payments are, what we're doing is we're taking cash and we're setting it aside so as our building needs attention, we can replace the boiler, replace the roof, repurpose that room on the second floor that goes from being an old writing laboratory into some kind of a new robotics experimental space to allow our students to try new things and take advantage of evolving curriculum. I put bond payments up here because when you use some kind of a tax-exempt bond to finance a building over 30 years, you really are building in generational equity. You are asking students today and students tomorrow to pay for the enhancement in the building. And that's what this generational equity is all about, is spreading the cost and making sure we're taking care of assets. And so Reggie wants to make sure we've done this. And then our last question, which is the one that keeps me up at night. And this is why Richard's book was so helpful to me, because he sort of focused on some of these questions. Can we keep doing what we're doing? Can we keep raising tuition, CPI plus 1 or 2 or 3? The question that the man asked earlier about, if salaries and tuition go up the same amount, isn't the reality, isn't revenue going higher? When I was a business manager, in my first year or two as I'm building the budget, I'm trying to figure out all of the variations of what we need to know, and trying to, you can imagine you're new in a job and you're running around trying to figure out how to do it really well. And by about year 3, I figured out that there was a really simple formula for building my budget, and particularly the tuition request. Is I would look at what our salary increase was going to be, and then tuition needed to be 1% higher. And the reason it needed to be 1% higher is because beyond salary there were other little things. Unless you had a major new initiative, paper would cost a little bit more one year, and sometimes it was utilities another year, and something else. But if the salary increase was going to be 3.5%, then I could guarantee you tuition had to be 4.5%. So I know exactly what he's talking about when he says, isn't it always going to be that way? And isn't, expense going to outstrip our revenue side? That's the question that has all of us as trustees worrying about where are we going. Enrollment stability. For those of us in schools in areas where enrollment got very soft around 2009, 2010, in areas where population is shifting and fewer people are coming to our schools, in areas where there is sensitivity to our tuition. Maybe you're the only independent school in town and your competition is the public school, which is a good public school, and it's free. Can we count on having enough students to fund our school? Can we count on annual fund growing every year? Because for many of us, as we build our budgets, we think about annual fund increasing. You know, what about auxiliary programs? Have we maxed out our summer program, or can that grow to match our tuition increases? Can it grow more and take some of the pressure off tuition? And what about endowment? How are we using that, and what happens in a time where there's market uncertainty? And so these are really the questions that Reggie has asked us to think about. And this is the part, I think, that finds all of us as trustees in independent schools right now really worrying about what's going to happen. I teach a class at Teachers College, and my students are getting a master's in private school administration. I teach the finance class, and so they're all terrified of my class. But they get over that because we do a lot more talking about concepts than we do building spreadsheets. And my class the other day, I asked them to think about schools entirely differently. And we had a fun time thinking about all kinds of wild new ways to do school. And it was really fun. But at the end of the day, they came up with two fundamental questions that get at the heart of why we're sort of where we are right now. The first was that we were talking about changing schedules and, you know, letting upper schools start at 10 o'clock in the morning when high school kids are finally awake, because they're not really awake at 8 o'clock. And all the research tells us that they can't really learn very well early in the morning. We need to let them come to school later. But mom and dad have to go to work. And how are they going to get to school at 10 o'clock? I mean, yes, there may be transportation options, but will they remember to wake up and get out of bed if mom and dad aren't there? Or mom or dad or whoever. And if you change the day, what happens to the working parent who counts on their child going to school in a pattern that matches their work schedule? If many more of us can work from home and telecommute and whatever, then maybe we have some flexibility. But if the general working population is working 9 to 5, 8 to 4, or whatever, then school sort of needs to be what it is. And then we had all these wild ideas about, you know, how to change the curriculum, turn things upside down, because you can do that, you know, when you're daydreaming. But one of my students said, well, wait a minute. We get all these crazy ideas, and we all think it's really fun, but what if the parents don't want this? What if the parents want what we've got now, and that's what they'll pay for, but they won't pay for this crazy off-the-wall stuff? Then we lose, you know, our customers, our students, and then where are we? And, you know, it brings me back to wondering why, when all kinds of schools promised dramatic changes in staffing and stuff in 2009 as they were recovering from the economic meltdown, and then you look at where we are in 2014 and there really hasn't been any significant change. Why is it? And I think it comes down to the fact that we are trying to serve our parents and their students, and, you know, and provide the best education we can in a construct that's been in place in the United States for a century or more. You know, the large school districts became a reality because of Teddy Roosevelt back in 1908. And that's why we are where we are today. Anyway, that's really sort of what I wanted to leave you with, is thinking about all of these things. And I'm hoping that you can take this and go back to your boards and sit down and have a really complicated conversation of sort of deconstructing your school. What is the essence of your school? What do you do extremely well? And how can you look at that in the context of all the financial pressures in a way that will help your families continue to be involved with your school.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Before we close, I wondered if there were any last one question maybe as we sign off. And if not, I think this has been tremendously interesting, provocative. I agree, Richard Soghoian's ideas are fascinating and challenging for all of our schools, I think. So anyway, thanks, Sarah, very much. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful week. And thanks for joining us on this webinar.